Yeah, so Paul asked me to talk about the next positive mental event, which is Apatrapya or Ottappa in Pali. It's this same word in Pali and Sanskrit, but the usually words are quite recognizable. Like, you have karma and kamma, but this is one of the ones that, because of the phonetic rules, it changes quite a lot. So Apatrapya becomes Ottappa in Pali. And this these two terms, Hri and Apatrapya, to use the Sanskrit, I've kind of been a bit curious about them for a while, because when I was studying Sanskrit and Pali, well, first of all, I studying Buddhism and Triratna, I learned about this distinction that Hri is about your own conscience, your own kind of ethical sensitivity, and Apatrapya is about the views of others, or how you're perceived by others. And then when I started studying, Buddhist sutras, I found that this distinction doesn't exist in sutra texts. And if you look up in the dictionary, Hri and Apatrapya, they're given as synonyms. The Pali dictionary says, it means the same thing. And they're very often put together, like in Pali texts. It'll be, Hiri-ottappa, Hiri and Apatrapya together as kind of like one compound. But then this kind of distinction where they're given a different meaning, as far as I can tell, it comes in the Abhidharma tradition, or Abhidhamma, which started kind of a few hundred years after the Buddha's life, or at least that's when it was kind of systematized and written down. It probably started earlier. But I think it's interesting because it shows the kind of process of systematization that happens within Buddhism, that we don't have access to the very early stages of Buddhism. We can kind of guess and extrapolate, but I think you get little glimpses of it. Like, when the Buddha's talking to his five friends just after his awakening, and there's this beautiful little story where the first person other than the Buddha attains awakening, which is his friend Kondana, and the Buddha says, "Oh, Kondana knows, and it's this kind of feeling of excitement and joy that he's actually been able to communicate it. So you get these little glimpses of, or you can get the sense of that this was something very kind of fresh, and the Buddha was kind of trying to figure out how to communicate it. And then, of course, later it gets very systematized. And when we read, Pali texts or Chinese Agama texts, there's lots of lists, and the teaching is kind of very systematic. And then after that kind of process of systemizing the teachings, there was kind of another stage of the Abhidharma where there was more of a philosophical analysis, and things were defined and put into lists. And these lists of mental states that we have come from this period of Buddhism's development, which probably like 300 or 400 years after the Buddha died is kind of when that was being done. So like before the Mahayana started. And I think what we have with Hri and Apatrapya is an example of something I think that happens quite a bit in this process, whereas the Buddha would have been using language in a much freer, more natural way, using different metaphors. There's loads and loads of metaphors and images in the early texts. And then later on, the Abhidharmas, they try and kind of define everything and give everything a very clear, specific definition. Whereas, I'm sure when the Buddha was speaking, he used different words in slightly different ways at different times, like we all do. So that's where this distinction between Hri and Apatrapya, I think, is introduced. So originally they just meant the same thing. some, ethical sensitivity, or, shame, but in a kind of positive sense. We talked about that last week, that it's kind of quite culturally determined. And then later, some very smart Buddhists thought, well, we've got these two words, so they must mean different things, and they kind of gave them these two different shades of meaning. But I think it's useful to think of them as, being like two aspects of the same thing. They're not, the distinction isn't an absolute one. So I was going to say something else. I forgot what that was. Anyway, so we have this kind of pair of mental states, or this one mental state that we can kind of view from two different perspectives. And if we take the Abhidharma definition, then free is it's about how we feel about our actions in relation to our own ideals. So when we feel that we've let ourselves down, when we feel that we haven't really lived up to the way that we ourselves want to act, our own values, then that sense of disappointment is free. And then Apatrapya is not just in relation to our own ideals, but in relation to other people. It involves the perspective of other people. And so this kind of, brings in the context of spiritual friendship, spiritual community, and spiritual hierarchy, which is a very a word that I think triggers a lot of people, because we don't like hierarchy. It's interesting experiencing Buddhism in Taiwan, where there is a bit more hierarchy, but certainly in the West, and I would think probably more in Japan as well. I don't know. People have an aversion to this sense of hierarchy, that someone is above me or has any kind of power over me, especially in a religious context. And for a lot of people, there's very good reason to be skeptical. There's been lots of instances where that kind of religious hierarchy or has been abused and has been very harmful. But what we're talking about, when we talk about spiritual hierarchy and Triratna, and we use the term in a very particular way, with a very particular meaning. And we distinguish it from a kind of organizational hierarchy or a power hierarchy. So, in any movement, any Buddhist movement or organization, some people have to take on responsibility. So somebody will be, running things. They'll be, signing the accounts. They'll be the chair of the Buddhist center or the retreat center or whatever. And so they have a certain job. In order to run things, that means they have a certain responsibility to make decisions. And so that's one kind of hierarchy, where people have different responsibilities. So some people might have kind of power over other people. They might be able to decide who gets a particular job, or whether someone's going to get a particular grant or whatever. But that's not what we're talking about in terms of spiritual hierarchy. And spiritual hierarchy is something that's in Triratna, it's not defined in the way that it is in a lot of Buddhist movements. We do obviously have a distinction between people who are ordained and people who aren't ordained. But certainly within the order, we don't have kind of different grades of order member. Everyone's just an order member. But within that, there are some people who have a much deeper practice. They have a much deeper experience of the Dharma than other people do. And that emerges. People can see that. People can notice that. And so there's a hierarchy that emerges naturally, not because anyone has any particular position or, gets a, special star on their CASA or anything like that. It's just because more people listen to them, because lots of people find what they have to say useful. And, particularly there are some meditation teachers who run retreats that are very popular, and they don't have any official position within Triratna. They're just, officially they're just an ordinary order member like anyone else. They're not on any council, or they don't have any particular job or responsibility. But they have a certain position in our spiritual hierarchy, because of the way that people feel about them, because of the way that people respond to them. So for me, I think that's a healthy kind of hierarchy, where it's not something that's forced on anyone. It's not that you have to listen to a certain person, but we have our particular experiences of people, and I think one of the things that certainly, attracted me to Triratna in the beginning, and one of the things that I always kind of, fall back on in terms of why I'm in Triratna, why I want to keep practicing in this context, is that, I have a personal experience of people who I feel have a deeper practice than I do. And sometimes people get very concerned about, oh well, is this person enlightened, or have they achieved this level, or there's all these systematizations within Buddhism of different like milestones on the way to awakening. Oh, so are they at this level, are they at that level? And I don't know. I'm not particularly concerned about that, but I do know that there are teachers within Triratna who have a lot more experience than I do, and a lot more depth of practice than I do. And if I get to where they are now in this lifetime, I'll be very happy. And so Apatrapya is about bringing, it's the same ethical sensitivity. It's the same feeling of tension between where you are now and what your values are, where you want to be. But it's particularly in that context of that hierarchy, of that sense that there are people that you naturally look up to, people who you feel, I want to be more like this person. So it might be that you think about your behavior or your actions in terms of how would this person view it if they knew I was acting in this way, how would they view that? And just kind of trying to imaginatively see yourself through that person's eyes, that teacher or that friend, or just imagine, well, this person that I look up to, would they act in this way? And if you feel that no, they definitely wouldn't, then that feeling, that kind of tension or mismatch between where you are now and where you feel you want to be, but represented by this actual person, not a kind of abstract, loving kindness as a concept, but this actual person who you feel kind of embodies loving kindness and metta more than you do. If you think, would they act that way? No, I definitely don't think they would. So I think that's the best way of understanding this distinction. But again, I think it's useful to remember that these two concepts originally were the same thing. I remember I was trying to think of an example of where this happens in English. So like this is the thing I couldn't remember. In English, we say neat and tidy. This is very neat and tidy. But actually, neat and tidy in this context, they mean the same thing. We're just using two synonyms, but it becomes a kind of figure of speech. So I think it's like that with Free and Apatrapya, that originally it was just like neat and tidy, two similar words that we put together to kind of emphasize it. And Pali and Sanskrit does this a lot. It's a kind of literary style thing. So if you remember that this was originally, we're talking about the same thing. It's a kind of ethical sensitivity, or a feeling of tension between where we are now, or how we experience ourselves in a particular situation, and what our values and ideals are. But if we, in the Abhidharma context, is more emphasizing the internal, and how maybe your ideals more in a slightly more abstract way, or in how you imagine yourself, whereas Apatrapya is bringing in that aspect of your relationship to other people, and particularly your relationship to people that you look up to, that you want to emulate, that you want to be more like, which is really really fundamental to Buddhism, because the whole basis of Buddhism is the idea that we can make progress. And so if in a Buddhist community everyone's at the same level of progress, that means it doesn't work. It's it has to there have to if it's a Buddhist community, then it has to by definition have people that are more advanced than you are. But of course, naturally that's difficult, and it can bring up reactions or difficult emotions, and that's perfectly natural, and it's just one of the things that we need to work with in our community and with our friends. So that's kind of what I thought about. Are there any questions, or is there something? Did I forget something important, Ariapala?
No, that's very good. Appreciate that. Very clear.
Very nice, Sraddhapa. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And the aspect of it being fundamental, and well, in a way, coming out of Shraddha as a sort of natural response to when we fall short, and I mean, maybe what Shraddha doesn't draw out a lot of is the ideal that's embodied in people. When we talk about Shraddha, and it does get problematic when you bring other people into it, because people are messy. People are messy, and we make mistakes. So I was sort of thinking, in that regard, in that regard of Shraddha, sort of permeating this whole Hri and Apatrapya as well. Shraddha isn't based on pleasure. It's a kind of an enduring emotion as well. But it's for me, it sort of throws me back on my relationship to other people who I look up to, and who are my dear friend, who are my spiritual superiors. I'll even use that word. But I can see I can see when they goof off, or I've had arguments with them and I've been unhappy with their behavior. Sometimes it's hard to, I don't know, hold the two. Respect and also realism, if that's the right way to term it. So that's been a big struggle for me. So I really appreciate going over these aspects again, and just trying to make that connection with Shraddha again. And I think around the spiritual emotions aren't always pleasant. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And we have to work out our relationship to the ideal that is embodied in people. Outside people, there's no progress really. So it's always in relation, and yeah. yeah, really curious. Good to have to think about that again. I mean, and even our own founder of our movement is human, yet he's given us, the tools of the Dharma as well. So again, it's like,
Yeah, and I think that's something that everyone has to deal with sooner or later. Whether it's I think it's an experience that probably almost everyone who stays in Triratna for a while has, because when you first meet order members, it's very easy to idealize order members, and also because when we're kind of leading a Dharma class or something, we're showing kind of our best side, and then as you get to know order members, you discover, oh, hang on, actually they have this bad habit or this weird thing, and and then it can be tempting to kind of knock them off that pedestal, and the truth is somewhere in between. And we like a lot of Buddhist movements have had to kind of contend with that with Sangharakshita, which is obviously on a bigger scale emotionally, because the amount of good that he's done is massive. And then he also had these ethical blind spots that were quite bad, and that's that's difficult to deal with. But at least we're not alone, I think. Plenty of Buddhist groups have gone through the same thing and dealt with it in different ways.
And again, coming back to Apatrapya, the burn. So if there is something we're uncomfortable about, it's other people we're trying to communicate with, and in the traditional, I think it's in the Pure Land tradition as well. There's the power of resolve and there's disclosure within that. There's a sort of opening up, being okay. There's mistakes, and we need to work to not do it again, or to move forward. And yeah, it's easy to want to protect ourselves, particularly as a movement, and then we've that's been a mistake as well in the past. I think we've tried to protect our faults, which is sort of using a sort of armor, sort of metal plate. It deflects things but doesn't resolve the problem, the dilemma, or the problem that needs to be gone into. And yeah, there is something, it is very vulnerable, that whole process of looking at one's own faults, or the faults of a religious movement or organization. People have to be willing and open. And again,
the natural response is to be defensive, whether it's sorry, the natural response is to be defensive, whether it's a friend kind of pointing out something about me that I don't like, or whether it's some outsiders pointing out things about Triratna that aren't so good. Our first response is to be defensive, because we often feel unfair, and it's sometimes it is unfair. And I think that's one of the main things we have to work with in this area, is like, okay, I don't have to defend myself. I can acknowledge, okay, I need to improve this. At the same time, if there's things that someone else is criticizing us for, or pointing out that isn't true or isn't fair, we can say, no, actually, this, I don't agree with this. But the other thing I was thinking was, in terms of hierarchy, we can, it's not always that another person is we don't always look up to another person in terms of every aspect of their personality or their practice. So, we might have a friend where we very much look up to them in terms of their meditation practice. And if we're talking about meditation, I would feel that, they have a much deeper practice than I do, and so I'm very much looking up to them and learning from them. But then in another aspect of practice, maybe my practice is more developed than theirs in that aspect. So it's not always a kind of 100% hierarchy, very often the way that kind of looking up to someone works it varies depending upon the situation.
I couldn't quite understand Apatrapya. I was reading Korean Apatrapya from last week after last week I was reading, because I couldn't quite get it. But then I got hurried, and then I couldn't get Apatrapya very well. But mentioning the hierarchy, and the people that you look up too, and it really is like that. In my case, if having that kind of like, I don't think I acted very ethically, or I did something, I not really unskillful, but it wasn't quite right. And the people I look up to, it really matters to me. How they view me after that, or kind of like it's very important for me. But then I don't know how to get rid of that. I don't know if Apatrapya, if it is a feeling that stays there for a long time. I mean, how long can you stay with that, with the feeling of Apatrapya? Is like, is there any antidote? Is there any medicine, to get rid of the Apatrapya? How do people feel with that feeling of okay, then I think I couldn't, live up. I did something, that changes the way they view me, but okay, probably is in my mind, but stays there. I'm still in Apatrapya, like,
Well, I mean, I think both Hri and Apatrapya, if we're feeling them more kind of intensively or sharply, it means there's something we need to resolve. And that's where the Buddhist practice of confession comes in, which is not at all related to the Catholic practice of confession. Oh, did I cut out there? So the Buddhist practice of confession, which is where we kind of open up, we make ourselves vulnerable. We talk to a spiritual friend about I didn't live up to my ideals, or when I acted in this way, I thought about someone I look up to, viewing that situation, and I immediately felt, I wouldn't want my friend to see this. And so you can confess to a spiritual friend, or more informal way, or you can and then that's a whole topic.
Breaking up a bit. Breaking up.
Important thing is, once you the you need to the situation. Okay.
You're
okay. Am I back now?
Yes. All that. Can you repeat that?
Okay, I'll turn my video off, see if that helps.
Yep.
See, I was just talking about confession, and that So that's a whole topic in and of itself. We could spend a whole evening talking about that. But the main thing is, once you've made the confession, acknowledged it, done anything you need to do to try and fix the situation, then you let it go. You don't keep making yourself feel guilty or kind of holding on to this feeling of guilt, because it's very important to make the distinction between acting in an unethical way and being a bad person. So certainly, for those of us who have a kind of Christian background, that this idea, I think, psychologically can be very deep, that the reason we do bad things in Christianity is because we're fundamentally bad. We're fundamentally sinful. And so when we do bad things, that's just an expression of the fact that we're fundamentally bad. Whereas in Buddhism, we're fundamentally good. We have Buddha nature. We're fundamentally awakened and pure. And the mental states that cause us to act unethically are like impurities that we remove, or they're clouds covering over the pure, brilliant blue sky, which is a real mind. So we don't need to identify with those actions that we feel don't live up to our values. So you don't need to identify with it. You don't need to think, oh, this is evidence that I'm a bad person, or this is the kind of person that I am. It's just, yeah, I'm not perfect yet. Keep working on it, but just you have to let it go. Do what you can to resolve it, and then let it go. Move on.
Oh, good.
I found when something would come up in my mind and I felt uncomfortable about it, I would tell a good friend. I'll try and tell them quite quickly, and yeah, not feel bad or guilty about it. Just say, look, oh yeah, I was a bit unkind thinking about my friend in this way, and I started to get, a bit whatever. And it depends on the person, and so sometimes it's good to pick the right person who doesn't judge you or doesn't say, well, you keep doing that, just is able to hear you and say, oh, okay, yeah. And they might want to draw you out a little bit, but rather than telling you what you should or shouldn't do, is just listening and being able to receive that well, because that then helps you to open up more. And so that kind of environment of, if you're being vulnerable, because that's really like, as Sraddhapa said, we're not trying to defend ourselves in Buddhism. You're trying to let go of this fixed identity. So rather than defending, you're sort of being vulnerable. So you need someone who's going to be able to be in that space with you without you closing down again.